Understanding the economics of Bitcoin's scarcity as a commodity is not an easy thing to do, and our guest today had this realization around why it works based on his experience as a cannabis grower. Eric V. Stacks is one of the most interesting and entertaining personalities in the Bitcoin space, and he's joining us today to talk about what cannabis growing taught him about economics and why Bitcoin's incentive mechanisms are unstoppable. I'm Scott Dedels. I'm the CEO and founder of Block Rewards, and part of our mission in bringing Bitcoin to the workplace is helping people understand how it will help them. So if you're interested to learn something about the laws of commodities and scarcity and why it applies to Bitcoin, stick around. This one is a ton of fun. Welcome to another episode of the Block Reward podcast. We are joined this week by Eric Stacks. Eric, welcome to the show.
Yeah, man. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
We finally made it.
Yes.
Maybe just for our listeners, could you give us like a quick TLDR of yourself before we hop into it?
Yeah. So I'm Eric V. Stacks. That's my alias on X. I'm a 16-year career cannabis farmer in Northern California, turned hardcore Bitcoin maximalist. I was born and raised in California. 25 years old, 24 years old. I moved from Southern California to Northern California to produce cannabis. I've been here ever since. I was one of the first licensed cannabis farmers in the state. I received a license in the beginning of 2018, which was a dream come true / kind of nightmare situation, which really helped forge a new perspective, I would say, about, political risk, real estate risk, business risk. And drove me down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And so I'm quite grateful for that. I ended up selling my business, selling the property, putting all of my wealth into Bitcoin many years ago. And I'm very glad that I did. So yeah, here I am now.
Yeah. So can you, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what it was about those, about that business process that led you down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. How did you connect those dots?
So I got to Humboldt County in 2009, and I worked in outdoor harvest, trimming a bunch of medical marijuana for an individual who grew a bunch of medical marijuana at the time. And I was very passionate. There's a long story behind why I developed such an affinity for cannabis, but we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. The long and short of it is I have an affinity for cannabis. And so I wanted to produce cannabis. And so I did. I saved up some funds. I started growing in a garage. I started a 501c3 so I could be lawful in the state of California. Prop 215 was the medical marijuana laws put into effect in the state of California that allowed you to produce and distribute cannabis. So I had been growing, for whatever it was, 8 years or so, when in 2015, Governor Jerry Brown, the governor in California at the time, signed into effect a bill called MRSA, the Medical Marijuana Safety Regulations Act, which put into effect the most basic regulatory framework for permitting and licensing in preparation for the people of the state of California voting into effect adult use. So you could say I was in the right place at the right time, where I had this experience and I had some capital, and I was in the midst of shopping for a property. And then the state of California is now issuing this new rule set that allows me to purchase land in consultation with Humboldt County and the state so that I could eventually have a licensed cannabis business. And so I did exactly that. And I achieved like the seemingly unachievable. And I bought this property, barely could afford to do so, scraped together every penny I possibly could, made it through the regulatory process in record times for extremely low cost relative to what a lot of people were spending. And right after I closed escrow, I started to go down the economic rabbit hole, because at that point in my life, I had the largest economic incentive, or the largest incentive in general, to understand the real estate boom bust cycles and what forces that I was contending with. Very quickly, within 6 months of learning about the history of money, the Federal Reserve, the creature from Jekyll Island, what happened in 1971, you start to understand the Keynesian economic model versus the Austrian school of thought and economic theory. I discovered Bitcoin, and I was very well primed to understand the magnitude of Bitcoin. And that was in mid to late 2017. And the big aha moment for me, especially as a commodity producer, because cannabis is a commodity, What's so special about Bitcoin, or the first thing that really blew my mind is that it's the first thing that we have discovered on planet Earth that as the demand increases, the supply then doesn't adjust accordingly. So as the demand goes up for Bitcoin, as we say in the Bitcoin community, honey badger don't care, 21 million forever, 21 million doesn't care, right? And so it's engineered money, and whatever we choose as the money essentially has infinite demand on it because money is a call option on any other good or service that the marketplace can produce. So what was so profound for me initially in that discovery for me, discovering the discovery of Bitcoin is that Satoshi essentially paired infinite demand with true scarcity. And being a commodity producer, I have watched the pound price of cannabis drop significantly as it's been liberated from prohibition and it's become more abundant. And so where you have a large demand for something and there's not enough supply, the free market will bid the price up. As the price goes up, the economic incentive for entrepreneurs and capital to move into that sector of the marketplace and satiate that demand with supply, that incentive increases, and then capital and entrepreneurs will do so, driving that price down. It's like Jeff Booth's work really comes to mind here, where he says it so eloquently, all prices fall to the marginal cost of production. And in my case, it was happening at rapid rate. And so, yeah, that's kind of a long answer there, but that's how I discovered Bitcoin and why I was in a position to understand the magnitude of how important it is to have scarcity in a money. Because I'd spent, 6-8 months really thinking very deeply about how our system works. Why does it work the way it does? And, the great financial crisis in 2008 and 9 happened when I was in my early 20s. So I wasn't in a position to really digest what had happened, what that meant. Like, I knew there was boom bust cycles within the economy, and I understood that there was like an economic crisis of sorts. And I was actually selling cars for a Toyota store at the time. So I saw firsthand like the liquidity crunch, the interest rates changed. People didn't have access to that cheap, easy capital. So they stopped purchasing as much stuff. So I felt the economic pain, but I was like 22 years old. I didn't know exactly what was happening. And so, in my mid 30s, sitting there on that property, right about to receive a license from the state of California, that discovery of Bitcoin was a big thing for me. That, and I was in the midst of like potential lawsuits from a neighboring city and a neighboring parcel, some older guy who had an issue with cannabis, although I was like following all the rules and the county and the state. And, I'm in the queue for approval, and, I had all this counterparty risk, all this political blowback, it was a very contentious, serious situation for me at the time. And also I was all in on this property, all of my money. I had borrowed a bunch of money from friends and whatnot so I could take this endeavor on. And it was like, it was a dream come true, borderline nightmare. And so, that whole vortex of like counterparty risk really helped push me and change my life strategy and kind of become more mobile, more flexible, but also like more impenetrable, you could say. So as I've taken on over the years a higher or like a larger Bitcoin position to like the point over the last, couple of years, I'm all in. I own 2 vehicles and I live in a rental. Like, that's it. All of my money is in Bitcoin because I am so risk adverse, because I don't want somebody to just turn my money off, because I don't want to be censored, because I don't want to be taxed, because I want to be able to insulate myself from all of the pitfalls of like the traditional financial world at large. So, yeah.
Yeah. What an interesting way, man. Like, I think that might be the best example I've ever heard in real life of somebody understanding the inelasticity of Bitcoin's issuance from a commodity trader standpoint and making sense of it. Like, these are sort of timeless economic truths that for some reason have just become completely obscured because of how ridiculous our financial system is.
Yeah, there's an interesting dynamic. I listened to like Harvard educated doctorate degree economists try to explain explain MMT, or the Keynesian economic model. And they start getting into these really like ambiguous, nebulous, and like incoherent explanations of like why, you got all this supply and demand forces and the money printing doesn't matter. And it's just nonsense. And if you listen to somebody explain the economy through the lens of Bitcoin or through the lens of like, the Austrian economic theory, it's coherent. It makes sense. It's 11th grade math. You're just like, yeah, of course, if you inject more monetary units into the marketplace at a faster rate that you increase the amount of goods and services that we're trading those monetary units for, you're going to get price increases. Like, why is that so hard to understand? But they can't really tell you that, because if they do, then it's going to be like an issue. And then all of the people are going to start grabbing their pitchforks and they're going to go to their local Capitol buildings and they're going to start rioting and protesting. Hey, you guys need to stop funding these things. Could you stop printing money and buying all these bonds? And, it's just like, yeah, it would be an issue. So there's this like nebulous, incoherent explanation trickling down from the top, from the people who are supposed to be the most credible in our society. And the reality of it is that understanding economics is quite simple. It's supply and demand, and what are we trading for those things? And in this case, we need a money. Money is a technology that allows our civilization to scale, and you can scale the division of labor. Without a money, you can't have like a society more than a couple hundred people, because you can't, there becomes a trade issue. So we have to have a money. It's not super complicated. And in some sense, I've spent the last many, many years like decluttering, getting all the bullshit out of my brain that we learn over, many years of our lives living in this, coming out of this broken paradigm. I call it the BB world, the old world, the before Bitcoin world, where we were limited to the technological shortcomings of a yellow, shiny rock. And then we had to add a layer too. We had to issue some certificates to allow that yellow, shiny rock to travel at hyper rates. But now you got a big honeypot. And now you got to trust people to not be corrupt. And the unfortunate thing is there's a small percentage of our society or our population of sociopathic shitbags who will do whatever they need to do to get the most and have an unfair advantage over other people. So, essentially they started issuing more certificates than they had gold on reserve. And I look at that as like a runaway train that we have had to take place now for the last, couple hundred years. And Satoshi fixed that problem. He created he completed the internet. It's like the completion of our ability to move information at hyper rate, and he merged value. Like he brought value onto that protocol stack, and now we can move value on that network in a way where you have final settlement and it's irreversible. Pretty special thing.
And he did it by creating the perfect commodity.
Yeah, he did the first scarcity. Someone hammered on me recently for calling it a commodity. It's technically a commodity, and we want it to be a commodity from the perspective of, is it a security or a commodity? But it's more than a commodity. It's a scarcity. It's actually the only scarcity that we have outside of our time. And so trading something that's truly scarce for your time that's truly scarce, that only makes sense.
Yeah, it's, as a commodity, it's the most saleable good. It's the most desirable good. The MMT is sort of based on this idea that money itself doesn't have a value, which is itself an absurd idea, right? Because we're trading your time for that thing. And one of my favorite meme images that explains this idea is like one of those power bars where the plug is just plugged into itself, and it's like, there you go, infinite power. And that's basically the idea.
Yeah. Well, and actually with MMT, and that idea that the money has no value. When you say that, I've never actually heard anybody say that, but when you say that, it actually explains this. It's an extension of what Jeff Booth says, where you have abundance in money, you create scarcity in everything else. Because the money, you end up shorting the money and moving out of the money and into anything else that's harder than the money. Anything else that'll project that economic energy, that life force forward in time more effectively than the currency does. And where you have scarcity in money, you create abundance in everything else. And in this case, with Bitcoin, it's the most scarce thing within the marketplace. And so as a result, the incentive is to hold that. And in my case, as an example, I don't own the house that I live in, and I don't own other houses that I rent to people. So in my area, I'm not participating in the real estate market. I'm not trying to buy my third or fourth house. And let's say, for example, that I own the house that I live in and I owned another rental and I had bought these houses 5 years ago. Well, I would have accrued dollar denominated equity that I would be incentivized to go and pull some of that equity out and take some of that newfound, technically unearned, it's only there because they're debasing the currency, some newfound unearned equity, and then allocate that to a down payment on a third house as an example. And that very quintillionaire feedback loop is what's contributing to homelessness. And it's contributing to single families not being able to buy their first house in America or globally, really. And so the fact that I'm not doing that and I'm putting all of my life force and all of my economic energy into Bitcoin is downward price pressure on houses. And so where you have scarcity and money, you create abundance and everything else. Like what's happening with the house is the same thing that's happening with my Ford diesel pickup truck. It's losing value. The problem is people think they're getting wealthier with their real estate portfolios because the monetary unit, the dollar that they denominate the value of that house in is just losing value so fast, it's creating the optical illusion of price appreciation in that house. The thing is that price appreciation is dollar denominated price appreciation. And so you can't accurately measure because you're measuring, it's like an algebraic equation with no fixed unit, no constant. It's nothing but variables. And this is why the Keynesians sound like such fools. This is because they're not actually you can't solve for that. It's like trying to build this greenhouse facility with a moving unit. It's like, hey, I'm going to take out my tape measure, but tomorrow the length of the foot has changed. It's crazy. And so on a positive note, to think that we built the civilization that we have here today with a broken ruler essentially is quite profound, really. And it makes me very hopeful for the future now that we have this essentially perfectly engineered living money too, by the way, that it can change and adapt over time. Which is just quite amazing, really. So,
I mean, you could also make the argument, there is people like Tomer Strolay talk about whether or not Bitcoin is conscious itself. And it's like, it's also sort of like metaphorically or metaphysically living in the sense that the participants that engineer any changes to the network are investing their not just their money, but their life, right? It's their conscious thought, their attention, their human kinetic energy. Like it takes physical energy to assemble a Bitcoin mine. Like all of these things contribute to, Bitcoin's life force. I guess you could call it that.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind is what Saylor says, where he's like, Satoshi essentially opened a portal into cyberspace and energy started to flow. He brought life to a dead realm. And kind of the way I think about that, and since you brought up metaphysics, is I think about it as metaphysical property. I think about it as like this invisible, metaphysical, thermodynamically sound monetary instrument that's a bearer instrument, that's informational, that I can have in my custody, that nobody can violate or take from me, and I can send it from me to you as an example, and it leaves my possession and it goes into your possession, but it's informational and it's invisible. Just so profound. I mean, for all of known history since the very beginning of time, if I gave you a piece of information of any sort, whether it was I told you, hey, go down that way, a couple miles or whatever, go to the river, there's a bunch of fish. I have a copy of that data packet, and so do you now. If I sent you an SMS text message or a JPEG or an email or whatever on the internet, I send you a copy and I have a copy. It's the double spend problem. And Satoshi solved that and created this informational bearer instrument, which is quite profound. That and another thing that comes to mind there from what you just said is Nikola Tesla famously said, if you want to understand the secrets of the universe, you got to think in terms of energy, vibration, and frequency. Everything has a vibrational frequency associated with it. And that's kind of where, going to another thing Saylor says, where Bitcoin is like digital energy, it's like digitized energy. We're literally like using electricity to mine these coins that then represent and store that electricity, and then we can trade that for goods and services. It's a way for us to like upload our life force into a metaphysical, thermodynamically sound monetary instrument and then trade it with each other. It's just quite profound. Like we can just draw. I spend so much of my time talking with people and just drawing like these abstract and profound metaphors that are all like quite real and true in a lot of ways. And it's like what is Bitcoin? It's a really profound thing. It's so many things, really. It's so many things, and like we're figuring out what it is. But what's very clear though is that it's a monetary protocol. It's an extension of the internet. I almost look at it like the completion of the internet. It's like the final piece of this network that allows us to send information at hyper rate to each other globally. But now we have the ability to send value over that internet, and so. It's kind of like the mycelial network in the forest floor that can send information and nutrition from one area of the fungal mat to another area and give it to an organism like a tree that needs it. Yeah, it's the most powerful network that we have, honestly.
Yeah, I've seen you talk about this concept, and I related around, thinking about the completion of the internet. It's like the internet also enabled access to information at an unprecedented level. And all of a sudden, the average person has like access to more stuff than the president of the United States did in 1990. And like, so we have this crazy explosion of the accessibility of ideas. What Bitcoin is kind of also doing is creating a way for us to standardize around one thing that we can tell is true. It's like, because along with that access to information has come, like, it's everything. It's the good stuff, it's the bad stuff, it's the true stuff, it's the fake stuff. And like we had maybe prior to Bitcoin, nothing to tether to, or nothing to like a beacon for humanity to like synchronize around. There's one thing that has absolute rules, absolute truth.
Yeah, and I actually think on average over time, the thing that we tethered ourselves to the most were religious ideologies. But they were all kind of different, but speaking to the same forces within the universe. There's like a common theme across all these religious ideologies. And those ideologies were and have been things that we have assembled around, but there has been a huge lack of agreement or clarity, especially amongst these different religious sects. And what's so crazy with Bitcoin is I think about this from a vibrational metaphysical standpoint. I think it's like aligning our civilization in a way that we have never have in all of known history, due to the fact that we have this mass agreement, this indisputable truth, this 850, 900 gigabyte ledger. Every transaction that's ever happened on the Bitcoin blockchain is downloadable if you have 900 gigabytes worth of computing space. So we can all download this list that quite literally shows where these coins have moved to, when they were, what addresses they were mined into and when they were traded, etc. It's just a ledger. It's an open and honest ledger. And that ability for us to pull that node, that ledger, and agree upon it in this indisputable fashion is like aligning our civilization and bringing us to this truth that we've never had before. And it's a super profound thing. And in some crazy abstract way, it's like we had to discover true decentralization. We had to have a decentralized, incorruptible protocol for us to centrally agree upon. For us to like unite over, we had to discover something that was like fragmented and decentralized and indestructible that we could then unite around. Yeah, and another thing that I do believe, and like from a spiritual and metaphysical perspective, I believe that we are creators of our own reality. And I believe that we all have our own independent realities. Like your reality is different than mine. You're living your own existence, which differs from mine and 8 billion other people, infinite people forever, right? But we are all contending in this consensual reality that we are consenting to. We both agree that we're talking on, computers right now, and we have all these things that we agree upon. And I think that without having a truth protocol, an indisputable thing, a ledger like Bitcoin, our consensual reality has not been very clear. And I think that as we have debased the currency, and whatever our civilization uses as a money is so powerful and so embedded in the subconscious and has such an effect on that consensual reality, as the currency is debased, it creates this low-grade state of psychosis among the populace, and it creates a high level of confusion. And I think that we're experiencing like a peak level of that high level of confusion within our society. And that's why there's such a divide and there's such a lack of clarity. That's why some people think men can get pregnant and you could just be whatever you want to be. And I think it's like a major detachment from an agreed upon truth protocol that allows us to live within our consensual reality in a much more clear and agreeable fashion. I hope all that made sense. It's quite abstract.
Yeah, no, 100%. It's like money. Money is a sense-making apparatus. It's a tool that we're all constantly using all the time to make sense of the relationship between objects and hopes and desires and everything that makes up our physical world. And they are, it is an internal thing. We all have a different understanding of it, but we're also all operating in different money systems. Like there's 167 different currencies in the world. We all have different rulers and measuring sticks that are working at different rates and with different varying levels of success. And I think about this, you're using the word consensual. I think it's interesting, the same root word, consensual and consensus. It's like when we're all using these different paradigms for making sense of the world, coming to consensus, which is really like a paradigm for how we can find agreement on something, is impossible. And so what really Bitcoin is providing humanity is a standardized and uniform way to make sense of something. And it almost doesn't matter in my mind like what that something is. It's the fact that we have now something that we can come to an agreement on. And now that thing is almost like becomes a paradigm or a template for us to have that radiate out into other aspects of society. It's like we can agree on the sensibility of having rules that make sense. And you can only really do that when you simultaneously understand that doing the opposite, or like agreeing on rules that don't make sense, is absolutely silly and absurd. And so these things are like they're like scales that tip each other. So I'm following what you're saying.
Yeah, and it's that discovery of scarcity that allows us to have a mathematically sound or simple monetary protocol. Because if we're using gold, the reason we used gold, there's 5 properties of gold. I think most people know what those are if they've thought about Bitcoin at all. The issue with gold was the value increases, the economic incentive to produce more of it increases. And so, for example, like the Peter Schiffs of the world, if gold blasts tomorrow to $5,000 an ounce, you're just going to make a bunch of unprofitable miners profitable, and then you're going to increase the economic incentive to take bulldozers into the Amazon and just rip up the forest floor and get more of it and dump more gold onto the market. So without discovering a truly scarce thing that you could use as a money, you can't have a mathematically sound money. Measuring the money and using that money to trade within things within the marketplace becomes borderline mathematically impossible because you have supply and demand dynamics taking place on a micro level across the whole globe, and measuring that is just impossible. And so having a fixed unit is very, very, very important. Very important.
Critical. Yeah, I think it is absolutely. Like if you think about if you ever played Sid Meier's Civilization as a kid or whatever, and the technology trees, like there were certain technologies that need to be developed before you could advance to like building the subsequent technologies. Finite money would be on that thing. If they were remaking that game for the first time now, like you wouldn't be able to build whatever cold fusion technology or something that doesn't exist yet without us first having had something like this.
Yeah, and when you have a central authority arbitrarily debasing the currency, you are moving economic energy from one group of people to another. You're essentially siphoning economic energy. It's like pulling a couple pennies out of every bank account on the whole planet at one time, right? So it's this slow thing where it's like a central group of people think to themselves like, hey, we could just issue a few more of these dollars. People won't really notice. The problem is that as you do that, and when you have an inflationary monetary system like the dollar or a MMT system or a Keynesian economic model, you're actually removing a percentage, and in this case, more than more. You're removing that productivity gain within the marketplace. So if the productivity gains, and we're currently measuring those in GDP, are 2, 3, 4%, and the currency is debasing at that rate or more, you're stripping those productivity gains from the society and you're giving them to one central group of people, allowing them to allocate that economic energy and fund whatever it is that they want to fund. And so to think also that we built the world that we live in today with a flawed technology that was gold, and our productivity gains are being siphoned out of the marketplace to fund war and crazy things that our central, planning politicians want to fund. Pretty interesting. And so when they lose the ability to steal those productivity gains in the future, when we're all on a Bitcoin standard, and I do believe that Bitcoin will become the world's money, productivity gains in our civilization, which are actually increasing as technological advancement increases and things such as AI continue to make things more efficiently, those productivity gains are going to flow to all people within the marketplace. Everyone using that monetary network, if it has a fixed amount of units, will benefit from those productivity gains. They trickle to every market participant or every network participant. And that's quite exciting, honestly.
Yeah, it's going to look a lot different than things look now. I don't know how long it's going to take, but I'm in the camp that it's faster than people think. I wanted to come back to one point you made a while back about what are your thoughts on the velocity of fiat money and this kind of like, I guess, thinking about it from the perspective of a finite commodity. What we're going to run into as more people understand Bitcoin is Gresham's law, like playing out in real time. So you're going to have this paper money that is like the power bar plugged into itself, and then you're going to have Bitcoin. And you find some Bitcoiners that think fiat money will survive and coexist. And then I would just be interested to hear your thoughts on how you think that would look.
So, gosh, I've been thinking about this long and hard, and initially through the lens of like 6102. Are we in for like some sort of a serious nation state attack on the Bitcoin network or Bitcoiners? Are they going to attempt to confiscate the Bitcoin that Coinbase is holding for these ETFs? And I just actually had a conversation. I was a co-guest with Jeff Booth the other day, which was a real honor. And I was talking with him a little bit about this. And when I think about it, I can speak to my experience, and I think this scales. So we live in a deflationary world where with human ingenuity and technological advancement, we're driving prices down on everything. But we have, and this is Jeff Booth's work, and in his work and his book and his thesis has really helped me understand the forces that we're all contending with. And in my case, I had an extreme version of. So we live in a deflationary world, but we have an inflationary monetary system, and the monetary units are being lent into existence as debt against assets. So what this means is in order for that monetary system to continue to operate and stay solvent, and for the people to continue to participate in it, the dollar, in this case, the dollar denominated value of those assets has to increase. The reality is that we're pushing the value of those assets down because we're producing them more efficiently. We produce houses more efficiently. A house in 1950 took a lot longer to build and a lot more watts, real world energy to produce than a house does today. Dude, today you could build a house in like a couple of days with some skilled carpenters and they got nail guns that just blast nails with 22 caliber bullets and whatnot. It's like quite incredible, the efficiency gains that we have. Yeah, 3D printing, all of these things. And so in my case, for example, a bulk wholesale pound of cannabis 10 years ago was like $3 or $4 grand. Today, a better quality pound of cannabis is $1,000. And in that period of time, my cost of living, my OPEX, you could say, is doubled, if not tripled. So I make anywhere between 1/6 to 1/12 per unit produced that I did 10 years ago. And so how do I combat that? If I scale up, it further exacerbates the problem. It incentivizes centralizing, centralizing force or becoming too big to fail if you scale that all the way up to like a large corporation. And so in my case, by adopting Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset or saving in Bitcoin, the appreciation that's taking place on my balance sheet is so tremendous that it offsets the loss of income on my P&L. And I think that scales. And I think that applies for a small business, a large business, a small nation state, a large nation state, a large corporation, central banks. I think we all have the same problem where we're operating within a fundamentally deflationary world and we have an inflationary money system that requires us to make perpetually larger profits as the currency debases, and procuring those profits becomes harder as there's more monetary units within the system. And so it's creating insolvencies, requiring more debasement of the currency. However, if people have Bitcoin on the balance sheet, as we're in the midst of a great demonetization where all this economic energy is moving out of these inferior assets into Bitcoin, if you have Bitcoin on the balance sheet, then the appreciation that takes place on the balance sheet means that you stay solvent. That means that you maintain a position of equity as opposed to negative equity, and that means that you require less bailout. And if the United States or if central banks want Bitcoin, they're not going to very effectively confiscate it because it's borderline impossible to steal from somebody if it's properly in custody. So much so that I'm comfortable talking in certainties, saying you're not going to steal somebody's Bitcoin if they've properly custodied it. And we live in an energy in, energy out world. And so you have to produce energy or make a profit with whatever activity you're implementing or behaving in. So the government's not going to go around attempting to steal people's Bitcoin because they're not going to get very much of it. It's not a very profitable business strategy. And if the government sets monetary policy, and you can say that the government and the banks are kind of the same, they're somewhat the same, and I look at them as basically being the same. They could loan dollars into existence against Bitcoin, which does a handful of things. It allows the central banks to take possession of Bitcoin because the Bitcoin has to collateralize that debt. It allows an escape valve, which is already kind of taking place for the inflationary forces within the dollar system, because they have to continue to lend more monetary units into the marketplace, more dollars into the marketplace to keep the asset prices propped up. We all hear that, like they're propping up the asset prices. And the reason that they're doing so is if they don't, then the asset prices will fall. Remember, we live in a fundamentally deflationary world. And if they do, the debt goes insolvent and we have an apocalyptic scenario. And so as they inject the monetary units into the system that are required to prop those asset prices up, they need to do so and keep the asset prices rising, but not too fast, because then you have too much inflation. And that's where Jerome Powell and his homies are scratching their heads. And how do we do this? And so Bitcoin is capturing some of that inflation. And if the central banks are loaning money against Bitcoin, they take possession of the Bitcoin, they have Bitcoin on the balance sheet. Bitcoin now can appreciate at a rate which actually, if Bitcoin too, some arbitrary extreme example of Bitcoin 10x's this year, it doesn't cause any problems for anybody. You could say, well, it causes problems for the central bank or the government, and maybe, but that's only if they don't. But if housing 10x's over the next 5 years, people are going to be homeless. So you need an escape valve for those inflationary forces. And if Bitcoin's on the balance sheet of all these financial institutions and there's insolvencies, then and the Bitcoin's appreciating, then there's less negative equity requiring less of a bailout. And so in some way with these two systems merge, and I could be wrong about all of this. I'm just a farmer trying to figure it out like anybody, you know what I mean? And so as these two systems merge, though, I do believe that Bitcoin is both fixing fiat, it's supreme collateral, it's really the first money, it's engineered money, it's the first money our civilization has ever had. We had nation-state issued currency units, we've had a yellow shiny rock, we had seashells, whatever. Those were just things we used as a money. They weren't engineered monies. And so because it's an engineered money, I feel like it's actually, and it's this energy network, the thermodynamically sound energy network that the free market is choosing to use as a monetary protocol. It's bringing solvency back into an insolvent world. It's like unwinding the detachment from gold that's taken place over the last 100 years and really hit hyper rate since 1971. And so it's bringing solvency back into an insolvent system. It could be, and I think this is what we're in for, supreme collateral to collateralize the required issuance of new debt into the marketplace to prop the current system up. So in a fascinating way, I think it's going to fix Bitcoin or fix fiat at the same time it replaces it and eventually makes it obsolete. I think that what's going to happen is that we're going to have Bitcoin on the balance sheet of all these corporations, then on the balance sheet for these banks, financial institutions, and nation states. And that is happening right now in front of our eyes. Like, it's taking place. Nation states are mining it. They're buying it. We got these ETFs. The FASB rules are changing at the end of the year. Corporations can market to market. They're going to be incentivized to put a percentage of their balance sheet is going to become Bitcoin. And so as that is happening, I think it's going to bring solvency in. And at some point in the future, this could be 20 years, 40 years, 50 years. I have no idea. We're going to end up with some sort of politicians who's going to be like, all right, well, look, everything is backed by Bitcoin. We actually don't even need the dollar anymore. We have Bitcoin now. It's infinitely divisible. We have all these layer 2s and layer 3s, and the development of the network will be there. It'll be the collateral that collateralizes all the existing debt in the world. It'll have appreciated at such a fast rate that we will have a solvent system, because currently the system is insolvent. There's not enough money within the system to pay back the debt plus the interest that we have globally within our fiat broken paradigm. And so that's a huge answer, and I hope that makes sense. I'm trying to unpack so much that I think about all into like one, distill it down to one little concept there. But essentially, I think Bitcoin fixes fiat at the same time that it's replacing it. So I don't think that Bitcoin's a threat to fiat. I think it's a solution to fiat. I don't think Bitcoin's a threat to the central banks or to the nation states or to the banking bloodlines or the elites or the ownership class or whoever, whatever. I think it's a solution for them. It's a solution for individuals and plebs like me. And the same forces that I contend with are the same forces that these larger entities or these powerful entities and people have to contend with on a macro level. And so it is this great solution that's essentially, it's like the greatest bailout in all of known history. Like, we're not going to need the same kind of 2008 bailouts. These politicians don't need to come up with more creative ways to inject liquidity. Well, they do in the dollar system, but the greatest bailout has taken place. Satoshi bailed us out. It's perfectly engineered money. It's a living money. It's a super profound thing. It really is.
Yeah, so like you were saying, the incentive mechanisms are the reason why it works. It works at every level, so it totally cascades. It works for individuals trying to protect their families. It works for businesses trying to stay solvent and in business. It works for nation states and everyone. It's like this positive feedback loop that gains momentum and energy the more people understand this and come together. So it has behind it sort of these I've also heard you talk about idea that really resonates with me is the idea that it falls in line with natural law. So it's a money system that also just works the way it's meant to go, like the universe is meant to be. We're meant to cooperate. We're meant to sort of exist in this like harmony with the universe, and the intrinsic principles of how this thing work also do that. So it does all this stuff, monetary theory and things that we can talk about, and then it has this sort of like spiritual metaphysical part that also explains the why it does this.
Yeah, and it's like this great imposition. Bitcoin is imposing like universal laws on all of us. It doesn't matter who you are, who you know, and what you have. You have to play by the same rule set. The same rule set applies to the Federal Reserve, to the United States government, to banking bloodlines, the ECB, every country, every individual. We all have to play the same game. We all die if we drive our car off a cliff. But currently, with our economic tech or our monetary technology, it's like the government can drive, or central authorities can drive some sort of economic, entrepreneurial, capitalistic business endeavor off of a cliff. And instead of them dying or feeling the economic pain, they offshore that death or that economic pain to the non-property owning class by debasing the currency. They paper over that. It's that great misallocation of capital that comes when you don't feel the economic pain of your poor decisions. And so if you send your Bitcoin to the wrong address, or if you fund something that the free market doesn't want, you start some sort of a business or some sort of endeavor that nobody cares about, and you pour a bunch of life force, Bitcoin, economic energy into this thing, you lose it. So if you lose it and you can't just unwind that, you can't just press rewind, you can't control alt delete, you can't just add more ones and zeros. We're just going to paper over that one. It's going to incentivize people to be a lot more fiscally responsible, and they're going to act just like they act when they're standing next to a cliff. Like if some dictator of a country or some president or some powerful elite, if he falls off a cliff, like there's nobody can press rewind. Well, that same universal force, that law of gravity, that same concept should apply to our monetary system. If you misallocate capital, you should feel the pain of doing so. This is why people are marching on Wall Street. Lock up the bankers. Well, now Bitcoin does that. It's imposing a new rule set upon our civilization. And Bitcoin doesn't care. Bitcoin doesn't care who you are, who you know, what celebrity you hang out with, who votes for what. Bitcoin doesn't care. You better be fiscally, as they say on the streets, you better come correct. You better act right, because you'll lose your coins if you make a mistake and nobody's going to give them back to you.
Yeah, and it also doesn't care whether you understand what it does or whether you know it exists, which I also think is really interesting. And this is kind of a Jeff thing, is this idea of like Bitcoin exerts a market force whether you are aware of it or not. And like that's true of a lot of people right now, I think, who have their heads in the sand or still think it's like computer money.
Yeah, but I'm also softening my stance on like being frustrated with people not understanding it. It's making their lives better, whether they have coins or not. Like no coiners, their lives are getting better as a result of the existence of Bitcoin. Because as an example, like BlackRock's buying coins, they're buying metaphysical, inviolable property, if you'd call it that. They're buying Bitcoin instead of more single-family houses. Maybe they're buying more single-family homes. I don't know what BlackRock's doing with its balance sheet. I don't particularly care, but I know that they're buying a ton of Bitcoin. And so that is contributing to downward price pressure on housing. That is moving economic energy out of a broken monetary system and into a thermodynamically sound, honest system. And that is making everybody's life better, whether you have the Bitcoin or not. So, and it'll always be here. And because of its simple supply and demand dynamics, it'll always appreciate at a faster rate on average over time than everything else within the marketplace. So it is a ticket out of a limited existence forever for everyone when they're ready for it.
Eric, you're my new favorite Bitcoiner, man. For people who are listening and they want to find more of your stuff, what's the best place for them to do that?
I'm on X. I post videos from time to time. I try to do it as often as I can, but sometimes I get busy. But I post videos talking about the long-term societal and philosophical implications of this new discovery. And I would say that I'm just publicly working out the thought process, my experience traversing the rabbit hole or go down the rabbit hole. Yeah, so I'm on X, Eric V. Stacks.
Thanks so much for coming on the show, man. This is a ton of fun. I'd love to do it again.
Yeah.
If you're listening and you stayed all the way to the end of the show, I want to thank you for tuning in. And if you enjoyed the contents of this conversation, buy my book, The Tao of Bitcoin. Eric hasn't read it yet, but
I look forward to it, though.
The subject of this conversation is eerily reminiscent of the topics that I discuss in the book. It's not by accident. This part of what Bitcoin is doing is synchronizing human consciousness. We are all having similar ideas for the same reason. And Eric, I want to thank you for your contributions and for expanding my mind today.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. This has been a very fun conversation.
Cool. Hope to see you guys next week. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Block Reward. We're trying to do something different here, creating accessible conversations meant for people who aren't obsessed with Bitcoin. If you found this episode informative and engaging, hit that subscribe button to make sure you stay updated with future episodes. Your feedback matters. We'd greatly appreciate it if you could take a moment to share your reviews and help us with our goal of creating Bitcoin content that is simple and easy to understand. Bitcoin has an important role to play in the future of finance. It will change the way we save, spend, and invest. Discover why Bitcoin offers a game-changing opportunity for forward-thinking employers by visiting blockrewards.ca. Block Rewards' mission is helping Canadian employers implement strategies for integrating Bitcoin into compensation and benefits, supercharge your recruitment and retention strategies, and help your team members plan for the rising cost of living by rewarding their work with the hardest money ever invented. Special thanks to our top sponsor, Paramount Employee Benefits Consulting, Canada's only Bitcoin forward benefits and pension advisory. For more information, find them at paramountbenefits.ca. Big shout out to Podigy, our production team that makes all this possible, and BMX Escape for producing our music. Bitcoin is an expansive and dense topic many people walk away from early. To Bitcoin enthusiasts looking for that podcast they can share with friends, family, and colleagues, one they'll actually listen to, we hope that is us. The content of these conversations is meant to be provided for information purposes only. Nothing here is investment advice. Bitcoin is a big topic. Be sure to do your own research before making any personal financial decisions. Thanks for listening.